All right. So here's how we're gonna operate this next part of the World War II lesson. We're gonna deal with turning points, and I'm gonna cover these battles in the campaigns that they were tied to. So we're gonna start with turning points in North Africa. The North African campaign was fought from the summer of 1940 to May of 1943. Initially, it was mainly the British against the Germans, and initially it was the British against the Italians. Germany will come in to aid the Italians. There will be some Australian forces that come in to aid the Brits. America does not get into this until later in the campaign. Turning point battle of the North African campaign, the second battle of El Alamein, which is kind of like lasts for weeks. It was fought from October to November of 1942. Germany, their defeat in this battle and the victory for the Brits will prevent the Germans from gaining control of Egypt, access to the Suez Canal, access to Middle Eastern oil, and also a southern route to the Soviet Union, and notably control the Caucasus. So, very important battle here. There's also another battle that I think is worth mentioning, and that's the port of Tobruk. This is where a group of Australian soldiers were completely pinned in and surrounded. Tobruk will eventually wind up in Allied hands, and it becomes an important jumping off point for the ultimate invasion of Sicily and later Italy. By the time the Americans get into this, it becomes a joint U.S.-British operation. This becomes known as Operation Torch. Most of this fighting is on the ground. American, British infantry, and also tank divisions. This was a massive tank campaign. Not that there wasn't air assaults taking place, but it was like a lot. Really major wind and sandstorms that were going on in this campaign, so a lot of this fighting wound up on the ground. The Germans' Africa Corps were led by a highly skilled and respected German commander, Field Marshal Erwin Rommel. Rommel will be known as the Desert Fox. In Tunisia, Rommel defeated U.S. forces until the Americans changed their command and put General George Patton in command of the Western Task Force, and the British 8th Army will be commanded by Field Marshal Bernard Montgomery. And this becomes a race to neutralize the Italians and the Germans in North Africa, and then ultimately to launch the invasion of Sicily, known as Operation Husky. A lot of real brutal fighting took place, heavy American casualties in the Kasserine Pass, but also the thoroughfare and doorway to be able to launch the invasion of Sicily. In Tunisia, joint British and U.S. command forced the surrender of all German and Italian troops in North Africa, though some of them managed to get out of there. Rommel, he goes on to lead a command in Western Europe that will basically be in control of the defensive position of the Atlantic Wall. We'll talk more about that when we get to D-Day. And like I already mentioned, large-scale tank warfare in this campaign. This also leads to the invasion of Sicily in July-August of 1943, Operation Husky. So we'll talk a bit about that when we get to the Italian campaign. Any questions about North Africa? What I have here is a map that just shows, if you see these lines here from Egypt to Tunisia, this is where the North African campaign occurred, and then ultimately it will lead to the invasion of Sicily. Malta was a jumping off point there, and then the mainland invasion of Italy. And then, as I said, we have tank warfare in the desert on the left and over there on the right. And these are the three leading commanders in the North African campaign. We have Erwin Rommel on the left, George Patton there in the middle, and then Bernard Montgomery. Rommel, after this campaign, winds up with a command in Western Europe. Then after D-Day, he gets tangled up in an assassination plot of Hitler known as Valkyrie. Has anyone ever heard of it before? There's a book and a film based off of it. And then Rommel had a couple of decisions to make. Would he go on to a military tribunal, or he had the option to take his life and save his family, and that's what he ended up doing. Patton, very interesting. After the invasion of mainland Italy, Patton will slap a soldier for cowardice in a hospital, loses command. Then he becomes the false flag operation for D-Day, the diversion, and then gets command of the Third Army by the end of the war, and is involved in Bastogne and the Battle of the Bulge and the mopping up effort after the fall of Berlin. And then, bless you, there's Bernard Montgomery. Montgomery is never demoted. He just keeps being promoted. During the war, he's one of the people that will orchestrate the Italian campaign. He's one of the people that will orchestrate D-Day, Operation Market Garden, and he'll be part of the British invasion force into Germany, and becomes one of the commanders that will accept the German surrender. Questions about these guys or North Africa? All right, let's move over to the Eastern Front. This is the Soviet-Russian front. Remember June 22nd, 1941? We talked about this last class. Hitler will break the non-aggression pact with Stalin and will invade the Soviet Union. This is the largest land invasion in military history. It involves 4 million soldiers along a massive front. They're actually in 3 military groups. The goal of the Germans is to take very quickly Soviet industrial centers and to physically occupy those cities. The Germans are not quite prepared for the resolve of the Russian people. Everyone gets behind the war effort. Civilians are going to dig in these cities to hold their industrial cities: Moscow, Leningrad, Kiev, and of course Stalingrad. And this is going to bog the Germans down. They wind up dragging the war out into the winter, which will be particularly brutal, and it will not be the only winter that they'll be fighting in the Soviet Union. The Germans followed what was called a Commissar Order. This is where they just totally rejected the Geneva Accords, and their treatment toward Soviet soldiers and civilians was horrific. This is also where the Holocaust really starts to ramp up for the Germans, and most Soviet POWs captured by Germans were shot on sight. There will be a reckoning that the Germans will have to endure as a result of the turning point battle, or rather siege of the Eastern Front, and that's Stalingrad. Stalingrad is important for a variety of reasons. Number one, it's an industrial center. Number two, it bears Stalin's name. And number three, it sits on a very important river that flows through Russia. It's called the Volga. Has anyone ever heard of this river before? The only type of river that I could really kind of compare the Volga to in America would be like the Mississippi. It is massive. Stalingrad sat on a real severe bend in the Volga that was heavily defended. This also just comes down to ego. Stalin doesn't want to lose the city because it bears his name. Hitler wants the city because it bears his name. This fighting was horrific. Street to street, house to house, underground. It was wild. In the past, this has kind of faded over time, but I've often asked students if they ever played Call of Duty World at War. And back a while back, like everyone's handling up, and now it's a little bit, a little more sparse. But they did this whole level on Stalingrad where your character's fighting house to house, and they totally nailed it. It's pretty crazy. So really great book, highly recommended book related to Stalingrad, Enemy at the Gates. They also did a film. I also had a book recommendation for North Africa, historical fiction by Jeff Shara. It's called The Rising Tide. It's a really solid book on North Africa, but Enemy at the Gates, highly recommended. Once the Soviets are victorious in Stalingrad, that's when they go on the offensive, and the Germans are now starting to slowly go into retreat. Stalingrad also is a big reason why the Americans and the Brits were not interested in putting soldiers on the front, because the way that the Soviets operated, they're running solo on supply. One guy would receive a gun going into battle, and the other guy would receive bullets. And they'd be like, when he dies, pick up his gun. But if he dies, you pick up his bullets. And then if they went into retreat, the rear echelon was ready to just mow them down. So that's not how the Americans and the Brits operated in battle. And that was a big reason. Stalingrad was a reason that the other allies weren't super interested in bringing their soldiers on the Eastern Front. Another significant battle on the Eastern Front is the Battle of Kursk, which probably sounds familiar because there recently in the war between Russia and Ukraine, there was a more modern battle that occurred at Kursk. But Kursk, guys, this is the largest tank battle in military history. It lasted from July to August of 43. After Kursk, that's when the Germans start melting back toward Berlin, and the Soviets go on the offensive. And they'll also maintain control of Moscow, Leningrad, Stalingrad, even though it was bombed to rubble, Kiev, and other industrial centers. So on the left, this is a bird's eye view of the rubble of Stalingrad. Bottom left, how hardcore is this? It's like a soldier jumping out of a hole in the wall, fighting in the streets of the city. Bless you. Top right, this is that area of the Volga. What lies south of the Volga are the Caucasus, which is rich in what resource for the Soviets? Oil. Very good. That's what the Germans want their hands on. And then this is kind of a brutal image, but one that I wanted to share. This is a group of Soviet POWs who are just shot by German soldiers through the Commissar order. So as the war wraps up, when the Allies are closing in on the Germans in Berlin, German soldiers are trying to run to the Americans and the Brits to surrender out of fear of what the Soviets will do to them. Because they know if they're not killed on sight, they'll probably wind up where? what do we call those prison camps? Gulag. They'll probably wind up in Siberia and the Gulag, and that is ultimately going to be the case. It's estimated out of the thousands upon thousands of German POWs captured from Stalingrad, because an entire German army surrendered after Stalingrad. It's estimated that less than 5,000 of those soldiers survived the war, or were ever released from. They were either killed or they were in the Gulag, and they actually survived it. All right, now we move to Italy. Turning points of World War II. After North Africa, the Americans and the Brits set their sights on Sicily. The Sicily invasion, it was not perfect by any stretch of the imagination, but it created kind of a bigger problem, and that was the Americans and the Brits didn't truly neutralize Sicily. The fighting in Sicily gave the German and Italian soldiers who were veteran forces enough time to escape to Italy. So the Allies occupy Sicily in Operation Husky from July to August of 43, and then they're going to launch a mainland invasion of Italy. But the problem with Italy is that some of the most fierce fighters and some of the most experienced infantry, notably the units under Albert Kesselring in Italy, were heavily dug in on two defensive positions in the mountains, the Gustav Line and the Gothic Line. These two defensive positions protected Rome. So the Americans start these, and the Brits start these massive bombing raids. And it's really sad because most of these bombing raids end up destroying unbelievable architecture and antiquities as a result. So, the Abbey at Monte Cassino, numerous cathedrals, museums, libraries were totally bombed out and torched as a result of this campaign. This was very, very slow going. America and the Brits are slogging up the bloody boot. Churchill called it the soft underbelly, but the people on the ground call it the bloody boot. A lot of American casualties in the Italian campaign, notably at the Battle of Anzio, where Americans were pinned down on the beach at Anzio. One very interesting anecdote from Anzio: minesweepers were out there trying to find buried bombs, and their metal detectors were going off, so they're slowly digging, and what they find is that the townspeople of Anzio had hidden their wine, buried them on the beaches. So the Americans and the Brits start stockpiling the wine, and when they're off duty, they're drinking wine in their foxholes, and when they're on duty, they're back to fighting. So a lot of American casualties lost. I think it's also important to mention a lot of American minority groups are going to win numerous awards for valor. Are y'all familiar with the Tuskegee Airmen, the Red Tails? This is the bombing campaigns they were involved in. I don't know if you've ever heard of the 442nd Infantry Unit. They were Japanese Americans who were fighting with their families and turned back home. And then there's another really famous group called the 92nd Infantry Unit. They're the Buffalo Soldiers that we talked about after the Civil War. They served with valor. And eventually, the Americans break through the Gustav and Gothic lines, and Rome will fall on June 4th, 1944. But the fall of Rome was totally eclipsed by what event 2 days later? D-Day. And that really frustrated the commanding officer on the Rome invasion, General Mark Wayne Clark, because he had been rising in the rank structure, and Rome falls, and then it just becomes, back page news after D-Day. D-Day was actually supposed to happen on the same day, but they got delayed for weather. Any questions about the Italian campaign at all? All right. Turning points of the Western Front, obviously D-Day, tremendously important. You guys need to realize the planning and the training for D-Day, it took about 2 years. Americans were preparing for this in 1942, like our U.S. airborne divisions, 101st and the 82nd, their training process started in 42 in preparation for this. Now, there was an initial attempted invasion by the Brits in Vichy, France, but it was a total disaster. They knew this one needed to have an element of surprise. It also needed to have an element of deception. That's where Patton comes in. He becomes the D-Day decoy. They set up inflatable tanks and planes and jeeps. Pretty wild. Quite a bit of theater there. And they're going to launch this invasion. This entire operation is commanded by one of the rising stars in the American military, and that's General Dwight D. Eisenhower, who'd been involved in the North Africa campaign. Now he gets the job as Supreme Allied Commander. American, British, and Canadian soldiers are going to land on 5 codenamed beaches in Normandy, France. Sword, Gold, Juno, Omaha, and Utah. Omaha and Utah were where the Americans were. That particular sector, especially Omaha, was horrifically deadly. U.S. Army Rangers are going to take Point du Hoc to control the position over on that beach. But before Point du Hoc is taken, numerous Americans are cut down and killed on Omaha Beach. Many of those were Virginians. And there's a notable city in Virginia, Bedford. I don't know if anybody's been to Bedford before. The National D-Day Memorial is at Bedford because 19 men from Bedford died on Omaha Beach on D-Day. That was the most men per capita of any town in America to die on that day. This, again, it's massive, right? We've got 4,000 invasion ships, 600 warships, 10,000 planes, and 175,000 Allied troops coming in from the air, coming in from sea. It was an unbelievable undertaking. June 6th, technically the invasion started the night of June 5th and really ramped up on the morning of June 6th. Highly recommended book for y'all to check out, The Bedford Boys by Alex Kershaw. Well worth your time. How many of you guys have seen Saving Private Ryan? Okay, that's another recommended film. And a really great series tied to this is Band of Brothers. Also a book, but it's a 10-part series HBO did. It's like one of those series that's kind of like timeless. Like I don't know. It's worth your time. So are you all familiar with this? Have you seen this yin yang of blue and gray around Virginia? You probably have, and you wouldn't necessarily recognize it. Keep an eye peeled as you're driving down highways because there are many historic markers and roads and memorials dedicated to the 29th Infantry Division, mainly guys from Virginia and Maryland who served on Omaha Beach. The 82nd and 101st Airborne dropped in to neutralize St. Mary-Glees and Carentan to take out German artillery. British 6th Airborne Division to neutralize Caen. And then here are the beaches: the Brits Sword, the Canadians Juno, the Brits Gold, and then the Americans Omaha and the Americans Utah. And the guy that was commanding the U.S. forces here is another rising military star. That's Omar Bradley, General Omar Bradley. Over on the top right, Dwight D. Eisenhower, Supreme Allied Commander. Bottom left, these are soldiers on D-Day. What they are inside of is what is called a Higgins boat. It's a landing craft that landed on the beaches. They were built in New Orleans, and that's why New Orleans is now the home to the National World War II Museum. If you're ever down in New Orleans, highly recommend checking it out. And then after 4 days, look at this. That's the beachhead. I mean, it was a floating city. Pretty crazy. D-Day questions? Anyone? All right. Turning points of the war to end the war in Europe. By the summer of 1944, the Germans started to launch the V-1 and V-2 buzz bombs. These were unmanned, basically short-range missiles, or at least the first of their kind. And the guy that developed it was an aerospace engineer named Wernher von Braun, who, after the war, will go on to be hired by NASA and is part of the American space program. A lot of German aeronautical engineers, through what is called Operation Paperclip, wind up in the U.S. space program. Highly controversial. FDR is reelected to a fourth term, but he's not going to serve much of it because he'll be inaugurated yet again for a fourth term in March, but in early April he'll pass away in 45. December of 44, the Battle of the Bulge. This is the last German counteroffensive. This particular counteroffensive ended up pinning down and surrounding the 101st Airborne Unit, and ultimately Patton's Third Army breaks through, and so begins the March on Berlin. And what's happening is that Berlin's going to get squeezed from both sides. The Soviets coming from the east, and the Americans, the Brits, the Free French, the Dutch, what little group of Poles managed to make it to England to serve. They're going to be squeezing the Germans from the west. This is where they start discovering concentration camps and start liberating them. Also, this is where the Germans start to surrender to the Americans. And are you all familiar with Varina, that area of outside of Richmond? There's a massive farm up there that is the same farm that like Pocahontas and John Rolfe had. German POWs were on those farms after World War II, which is kind of wild. I had a former student whose grandmother grew up on a farm in Nebraska, and her family's farm was full of German POWs, which I found to be quite interesting. Yalta occurs in February of 45, February 4th to the 11th. This was a meeting between Roosevelt, Churchill, and Stalin. The goals of Yalta: how's the war going to end in Europe? How are the Allies going to initiate the movement toward the United Nations in the post-war era? And what are they going to do with the land? How's it going to get carved up? Who occupies what? Notably in Germany, That's why a lot of historians say the origin of the Cold War is at the end of World War II at Yalta. And at another conference I'm going to talk to you about here momentarily called Potsdam. Americans continued to bomb German cities. Why would the Americans and Brits want to bomb places like Hamburg, Dresden, Berlin, and why would those cities be bombarded? What were those cities producing? What were the cities like Berlin, Dresden, Hamburg? What were they producing? Yes, they're like the war machine cities. So, but the sad thing is, most of the people that are killed are just like children and civilians, but a lot of kids die. Also, at the end of that war, Hitler throws the Hitler Youth and the elderly into the war effort to try to hold Berlin. On April 11, American and Russian soldiers reached the Elbe. On April 12th, FDR passes away in Warm Springs, Georgia. Harry S. Truman takes the oath of office. By the end of April, Mussolini and his mistress will be killed by Italian partisans. And at the very end of April, Hitler marries his longtime girlfriend, Eva Braun, outside of his bunker. And he and his entire inner circle will pretty much commit mass suicide as Berlin is surrounded by the Soviets, the Americans, and the Brits. Berlin falls on May 2nd. Karl Dönitz ends up basically taking over for Hitler, kind of in a weird way. He had been a leading admiral in the German submarine fleet. And the Victory in Europe Day was celebrated on May 8, 1945. Any questions up to this point? So on the top left, that is what the Ardennes looked like during the Battle of the Bulge. Top right, we have Churchill, FDR, and Stalin at Yalta in Crimea. Bottom left, that's what a buzz bomb looked like. Also, the buzz bomb launch sites became a major target and goal for British and American bombers at the end of the war. And then over here on the bottom right is a very famous picture of American and Soviet soldiers shaking hands across the Elbe. But the Soviets aren't going to give up their position, and the Americans and the Brits aren't going to give up their position. Potsdam, this conference will take place at the end of July through early August in Germany. What are the goals of Potsdam? How will the war end in Japan? What are they going to do with the Nazis? How are they going to be put on trial? They settle on the Nuremberg trials. Do y'all have any idea why they chose Nuremberg? Do you know the significance behind that? I'm going to get into this when we talk about the Holocaust next class. No one knows. That's where the Holocaust started, with Hitler's Nuremberg laws that were passed in 1935. So it was symbolic. The independence of Israel is part of the conversation, and also everybody's keeping their cards close to their vest. But what does Truman now know that he has access to? What does Truman know he has access to now? The bombs. He knows about the Manhattan Project. And he knows that this instrument of war could be used to bring the war to an end. So when this concludes, a letter will be sent from the Allies to the Japanese, basically saying, now's the time to surrender. If you surrender, then we'll reach an agreement. But if you do not surrender, we will use an instrument of war to bring about an end to this war. And the Japanese ignored it. And that's what's ultimately going to carry us to the atomic bombs being dropped. Another issue about Potsdam, also early roots of the Cold War. So the top right, we have Churchill, Truman, and Stalin meeting in Potsdam. And then the bottom right, we're going to talk more about that later. That's the Nuremberg trials. All right, turning points in the Pacific. We already talked about Pearl Harbor last week. Now, 6 months after Pearl Harbor, we have a very important turning point, the Battle of Midway. Midway Atoll was not very far from Hawaii. If the Japanese take Midway, this would give them a jumping off place to not only attack Pearl Harbor or attack Hawaii again, but it would also give them a jump off to potentially attack California or the West Coast. A lot is achieved in these 3 days in the Battle of Midway, fought June 3rd through 6th, 1942. It is a carrier-based battle. Planes buzzing around in dogfights over the Pacific and the defensive position of Midway holding. By the end of this ordeal, America will sink 4 Japanese carriers. How many aircraft carriers will the Japanese rebuild? 0. They don't have the capability. This is where, like the American war machine, it's just getting started by this time. It's ramping up. And America's just churning out boats and planes and tanks and jeeps and trucks and guns and bombs. And Japan's, they're limited. Their output's limited by this time. All right? Also, we broke the Japanese code purple. And, of course, we hold the atoll. That is the Midway Atoll. And this is an aerial view of the battle. Questions about Midway? We're already familiar with the Allied strategy in the Pacific, island hopping. America mostly fought the Pacific campaign alone. Now, there was some support from the Aussies, notably in Papua New Guinea, but most of our island hopping involved U.S. Marines, Navy, and the U.S. Army, okay? So, pivotal moment in the island hopping campaign is going to be early on, and that is when the Marines take Guadalcanal in the Solomon Islands. They fought from August to November of 1942. This allows them to build Henderson Airfield, and now the goal is every time they get closer and get a new island, the Navy Seabees come in, build landing strips, and we just keep getting closer and closer. But as we get closer and closer, it gets more and more deadly and horrific because the Japanese live by the Bushido Code, death before dishonor. Not just the soldiers, but also the civilians. One very alarming instance of this is in Saipan. When the Americans successfully took Saipan, even the Japanese civilians, rather than getting aid and help from the Americans, committed mass suicide by jumping off cliffs. It's called the Bushido Cliff, or the Bonsai Cliff, rather. And this just gets nastier and nastier. Peleliu, Tinian, Kwajalein, Iwo Jima, Okinawa. It got real bad in Iwo Jima and Okinawa because the thing that made these a little bit different It was as close as we had gotten to Japan, but these were Japanese home islands. And I mean, like, Iwo Jima was like a speck of volcanic rock. But like Okinawa is like a legit island where people lived and like had lives. So this is hard going. And really the reason they end up dropping the atomic bombs rather than an invasion is because of how deadly Iwo Jima and Okinawa were. Marshall and the War Department were like, we're estimating 1 million casualties if we try to invade mainland Japan, which would have required America to basically mobilize all the forces in Europe and bring them to the Pacific. So it's not just like there's so many layers and variables and reasons why there's not an invasion of mainland Japan. There's also the Soviet issue too. If the Soviets come in from the east, then are the Americans going to have to like carve up Japan with the Soviets? Does that make sense? So there's a lot to that decision. The Philippines will be retaken. MacArthur will return. Very famous battle in the Philippines to retake the Philippines, the Battle of Leyte Gulf. That's actually one my grandfather was involved in. Also, did you guys ask me about kamikazes last class? Or was that another class? Somebody asked me in another class, when do kamikazes come about? The Philippines, Leyte Gulf. They don't start using kamikaze pilots until the end of the war. And that was a really sad situation. Basically, the kamikaze pilots were like, for the most part, pretty well-educated Japanese men who they brought in and were like, well, these guys are pretty sharp. We can at least teach them how to fly a plane and, convince them to crash it into a ship. So there's a pretty interesting exhibit at the World War II Museum in New Orleans based around the kamikazes. Those are turning points in the Pacific. This is MacArthur returning to the Philippines. This is the flag raising on Mount Suribachi at Iwo Jima. And then I wanted to use this map. That is where Iwo Jima is located. You can see how close we get. And Okinawa is even closer. All right. This is where we pump the brakes today. Victory in Japan, VJ Day. So as I previously said, the Allies let Japan know that if they didn't surrender, they were going to bring the war to an end. That was August 2nd or 3rd that was sent out, and it was ignored. So August 6th, Paul Tibbets and the Enola Gay crew will drop the first atomic bomb on Hiroshima. Still no surrender. Bless you. August 9, Charles Sweeney and the Boxcar crew, they're going to drop the next bomb on Nagasaki, which that mission was like a total disaster. They almost got shot down, first off. They almost missed the target, secondly. And third, they almost ran out of gas and crashed on the way back. Hey, all right. Thank you. So that's a little bit about the bombs being dropped. Japan will officially surrender aboard the USS Missouri in Tokyo on September 2nd. If you ever go to Oahu and you visit Pearl Harbor, the Missouri is at Pearl Harbor, so you can actually go visit the monument, walk on the surrender deck. It's pretty interesting. VJ Day was celebrated in Britain on August 15. VJ was celebrated in the U.S. on the actual day of the surrender. And America, under the command of MacArthur, will take occupation of Japan as a result of this surrender. Why Hiroshima and Nagasaki? Why those cities? Yeah. There was a secondary target on the second mission. But why would these two cities, I think the city will come to me, starts with a K. There was a secondary target city. Why would these cities be places that would be attacked? Any ideas? Yes, they're industrial centers. This would have been like the equivalent of like Pittsburgh and Detroit getting bombed during the war. If that makes sense. What is the name of that city? It'll come to me. Anyhow, I'm gonna rack my brain a little bit. Yes, thank you. Very good. Starts with a K, right? Yeah. All right, awesome. Okay, you guys good? Awesome. I got a couple of things I need to hand out here.